welcome back to Dukascopy TV. Today I'm joined in the studio by John Hancock to discuss China after manufacturing data showed to be growing at a slower than expected pace. John, thank you so much for coming into the studio.
Thanks for having me.
Now, if we look at the data, the manufacturing data, as growth slows, it puts pressure on the government to do something to perhaps increase stimulus, but officials have said that they're not going to pursue the old measures, if you will, at the extent of structural reform. There might be a risk of systematic financial crisis here, John, but do you think there's some positives to be taken from the fact that the lack of intervention, if you will?
Well, it's funny that China's having the same debate in a way that we're having all over the world. I mean, it's the debate that's taking place in the United States, it's the debate that's taking place in Europe and in Great Britain, to stimulate or not to stimulate, austerity or spending. China's going through the same thing. But I think in the Chinese case, in a sense, that debate masks or obscures the deeper debate, which is really about structural reform and the course that the overall economy is going to head on or go on over the next several decades. Bear in mind that China for 3 decades has followed an export-led growth strategy, and it's been very successful. I mean, 9%, 10% growth every year, but it's been done explicitly by exporting manufactured products largely to the rest of the world at the expense of domestic consumption. And in that context, stimulus isn't going to do it. In a way, it's a deformed economy or a mutated economy. And to fix that mutation, to fix that deformity, you have to undertake a much deeper and more profound structural reform than is currently being considered or debated, at least publicly.
Now, obviously, when we talk about China, slowing growth, it's at some extent, it's 2, 3, maybe 4 times better than other developed countries, which we wish to talk about. But some experts, namely Nomura, are saying that perhaps China is in for a hard landing at the end of 2014. How real do you think this risk is, John?
Well, I think part of the thing that's amazing about these latest numbers is that the reason for the pessimism is I think China's growth rate came in at 7.8%, as you pointed out, a remarkable number, instead of 8%, and everyone had a panic or a mini panic. I don't think the panic should lie in the numbers, in those specific numbers. Again, it gets back to this question of what's happening at a deeper level in the Chinese economy. Is this a sustainable model? And I think if you look more closely at the export numbers, the consumption share of the economy, the investment share of the economy, China still consumes 49% of its GDP on reinvestment in the economy. That's a staggering amount. That's too much. That's a bit like what the Soviet Union was doing during its phenomenal growth stage. We forget that in the 1950s and 60s, the Soviet Union was growing at 6, 7%, and everyone thought it was a miracle economy, but largely by taking a lot of the GDP wealth out of the economy and reinvesting it. Domestic consumption, domestic demand is just 36% of the Chinese economy. So the model itself is reaching the limits of its effectiveness. Can China reform itself and shift a greater share of the growth dynamic to the domestic economy? And that's hard for any economy to do. It's hard for the United States to undertake structural reform. It's hard for the UK, for France. We're all going through a structural reform debate. Maybe in China, it's even harder, and I would argue it's harder for 2 reasons. One, the success of the past policy makes it harder to shift gears. I mean, it's like you're running a business and you've got a great growth model of your Apple computers and you're making a fortune off of iPhones and iPads. Very difficult to say, well, we've got to change tack, we've got to ditch these products and move on to something completely new. China has done great. It's done more than great. I mean, the Chinese growth miracle is the biggest economic miracle in history. No country with that many people has grown this fast in this consistent a way. To take that model and say, we've got to change it, we've got to reinvent it, we've got to come up with something new, that's tough. Added to that is the problem that China's not a democracy. I mean, this is not a system where government is forced to change, that there's no underlying, if I can use the word, market pressure, democratic pressure to change. And these kind of systems find it very hard to adapt. They're very good at holding the course, rather less good at changing tack.
Now, as you say, it's difficult to change tact, especially when you don't know which route to go in. They've also got other problems with structural reform and expectations of strength in the yuan. John, we've spoken about currency wars in the past, and with countries such as Japan seemingly deliberately depreciating their currency. Do you think that there's the likelihood that China might be the next country to follow suit if the problems get worse?
Well, we have to bear in mind that Japan and China are quite different monetary systems or exchange rate systems. I mean, China already has a fixed exchange rate. It's a bit like the old Bretton Woods system recast for the 1990s and 2000s. It's pegged to a basket of currencies, but is essentially pegged mainly to the US dollar. So China is already dramatically and directly intervening in its exchange rate policy to help its economy, to provide an export boost to its sector, effectively a hidden subsidy. Japan complicates that because, of course, Japan is one of China's major trading partners. This recent policy of the Bank of Japan and the Finance Ministry is putting downward pressure on the yen, which in turn is going to put pressure on the yuan to follow suit. We're back in the world we discussed before of kind of beggar thy neighbor policies. What is good for Japan isn't necessarily good for its trading partners. Up till now, what has been good for China hasn't necessarily been good for its trading partners. And we find ourselves almost in a games theory kind of situation, a kind of a prisoner's dilemma, where everyone is engaging in a race to the bottom. Will China have to reevaluate its peg? I don't know, we'll have to see.
We will have to wait and see, but John, thank you so much for your insights today. It's been a pleasure chatting it through with you.
Thanks for having me.
Well, that's all from me in the Geneva studio. Click back to Dukascopy for more exclusive interviews and press reviews. Goodbye for now.